Ma'am, can I see your ID? What are you doing here?
Am I being detained? I'm being here. Am I free to go?
I need you to verify who you are. There have been incidents in this.
The flickering neon sign of the Exxon station buzzed with a low electric hum that seemed to vibrate through the heavy, rain-slicked air of the Tuesday night. Deputy Martin Hayes sat slouched behind the wheel of his idling cruiser, the rhythmic sweep of his windshield wipers the only movement in the otherwise desolate lot. At 42, with 15 years on the county force, Hayes considered himself a veteran of human nature. He believed in instincts, in the unspoken language of the streets, and in a gut feeling that he proudly called his internal radar. It was a radar that, over the years, had slowly and quietly calibrated itself to view the world through a lens of conditioned assumptions, though he would fiercely deny any accusation of bias if confronted. He was just doing his job, keeping his affluent, quiet suburban district safe from the encroaching problems of the neighboring city. Through the streaks of rain on his windshield, a silver sedan pulled up to the furthest pump. The car was a few years old, clean but unassuming. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out into the harsh, artificial glare of the canopy lights. She was a black woman in her early 50s, dressed in faded gray sweatpants and an oversized, comfortable college sweatshirt. She moved with a quiet deliberation, swiping her credit card and reaching for the nozzle. To anyone else, it was a completely mundane scene, an exhausted traveler stopping for fuel near midnight. But to Hayes, a silent alarm tripped in the back of his mind. She didn't look like the residents of his jurisdiction. The car's license plate frame advertised a dealership from the city, 20 miles away but a world apart in terms of demographics and socioeconomic status. She was out of place, and in Hayes's world, being out of place was the first stepping stone to reasonable suspicion. He didn't see an exhausted professional heading home. He saw a question mark that his authority demanded an answer to. Hayes shifted the cruiser into drive and let it roll silently across the wet asphalt, pulling up at an angle that wasn't quite blocking her in, but was positioned deliberately enough to assert dominance. He stepped out of the vehicle, the heavy clatter of his utility belt breaking the quiet of the night, his hand resting casually but purposefully near the butt of his sidearm. The woman at the pump didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, acknowledging his presence with a calm, steady gaze as the fuel continued to flow. Hayes approached, adopting the aggressively polite drawl he reserved for encounters he intended to control. He offered a slight nod and said it was a late night to be out driving. The woman, whose name was Eleanor Vance, offered a polite, non-committal smile and agreed that it was indeed late. She didn't offer an explanation of where she was going or where she had been. Her silence, perfectly legal and entirely normal, irritated Hayes. He was used to deference, to nervous over-explanation, to civilians stumbling over their words to appease him. Eleanor simply stood there, waiting for her tank to fill. Hayes took a step closer, crossing the invisible boundary of personal space, and asked to see her identification. Eleanor's eyes narrowed just a fraction, a micro-expression of weary recognition. She didn't reach for her purse. Instead, keeping her hands entirely visible, she asked a very simple, very precise question. Was she suspected of committing a crime? The question struck Hayes like a physical blow. It was the language of the courtroom, the language of resistance. In his mind, an innocent person just handed over their license. He puffed out his chest slightly, leaning on the familiar crutch of his authority, and stated that there had been some break-ins in the area recently, and he was just trying to establish who was moving through his town at this hour. Eleanor remained perfectly composed, her voice level and devoid of any combative edge, as she informed him that while she appreciated his diligence, unless he had a reasonable, articulable suspicion that she was involved in a specific crime, she was under no legal obligation to produce identification during a consensual encounter. It was a flawless summarization of Terry versus Ohio and the principles of the Fourth Amendment, delivered with the casual ease of someone remarking on the weather. For Hayes, however, this legal accuracy was not an assertion of constitutional rights. It was a challenge. It was evasive. It was suspicious. The encounter shifted instantly in his mind from a casual inquiry to an investigation. He ordered her to hand over her ID, his voice dropping the polite facade and adopting the sharp bark of a command. Eleanor knew exactly what was happening. She recognized the dangerous pivot from a consensual conversation to an unlawful detainment. She knew the statistics, the tragic histories of late-night stops escalating over bruised egos, and the fragile line between asserting one's rights and inviting violence. She slowly withdrew her wallet, extracted her driver's license, and handed it to him, deciding that the battle of the gas pump was not worth her physical safety. Hayes snatched the plastic card, examining it under the harsh light. Eleanor Vance, an address from the upscale side of the neighboring city. It didn't fit the narrative he had constructed, which only fueled his frustration. He handed the license back and, searching for a way to regain the upper hand, ordered her to step away from the vehicle. When she asked why, he deployed the oldest, most legally insulated tactic in law enforcement. He claimed he smelled the faint odor of marijuana coming from the open door of her car. Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach, not of fear, but of profound, exhausted disappointment. She did not smoke. Her car did not smell of marijuana. It was a complete fabrication, a manufactured pretext to establish probable cause where none existed, effectively bypassing the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches. She looked Hayes directly in the eyes and stated, clearly and unequivocally, that she did not consent to a search of her vehicle and that he was manufacturing probable cause. Hayes smirked, a fleeting expression of absolute power, and told her that based on the odor, he didn't need her consent. He ordered her to place her hands on the trunk of the car. Eleanor complied, her movements slow and deliberate, speaking clearly into the night air to ensure the microphone on his dashcam picked up every word, reiterating that the search was illegal and conducted without consent. Hayes patted her down, finding nothing, and then proceeded to tear through the interior of her sedan. He pulled out the contents of the glove box, rummaged through her center console, and unzipped her gym bag in the back seat. He found legal pads, a pair of reading glasses, a spare change of clothes, and mints. No drugs, no weapons, no stolen property, nothing but the mundane detritus of a busy life. The humiliation of standing spread-eagled against her own car in the cold rain while a man violated her privacy was a burning sensation. But Eleanor forced her breathing to remain steady. When Hayes emerged from the car, empty-handed and visibly agitated, he didn't apologize. An apology would be an admission of error. Instead, his ego demanded a justification for the escalation. He unclipped his handcuffs and informed Eleanor that she was being placed under arrest for obstruction of an officer and failure to obey a lawful command. He spun her around, forcing her arms behind her back with unnecessary roughness, the cold steel of the cuffs biting into her wrists. Eleanor didn't resist, didn't argue, and didn't scream. She allowed herself to be guided to the back of the cruiser, her silence a heavy, impenetrable armor. She understood the grim reality of the moment. The side of the road is never the place to argue the law, because the officer has the gun, the badge, and the immediate physical power. The fight belonged in a different arena. The booking process at the county jail was a masterclass in dehumanization. Eleanor was processed through the sterile, concrete environment, stripped of her belongings, fingerprinted and photographed. She sat on the hard metal bench of a holding cell, watching the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, listening to the echoing sounds of radios and jingling keys. The young deputies walking past the cell saw a suspect in a faded sweatshirt. They didn't see the mind that was actively memorizing every procedural misstep, every constitutional violation, every arrogant assumption made by Deputy Hayes. She used her single phone call to reach her husband, a corporate attorney who knew better than to ask frantic questions. He simply listened to her calm instructions, woke up a local bail bondsman, and quietly secured her release by the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon. Eleanor walked out of the precinct into the crisp morning air, her wrists slightly bruised, her mind razor-sharp. She went home, showered the smell of the holding cell off her skin, put on a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, pulled her hair back into a severe, elegant twist, and drove to work. The transition from the humiliation of the night to the rigid formality of the morning was jarring, but for Eleanor, it was a necessary compartmentalization. The county courthouse was a grand, intimidating structure of marble and dark oak, a stark contrast to the grimy utility of the police station. On this particular Wednesday, the courthouse was buzzing with a chaotic energy. The regular circuit judge for the county's criminal division had suffered a mild heart attack over the weekend, throwing the docket into disarray. To prevent a backlog, the state Supreme Court had authorized an emergency, temporary transfer of a highly respected judge from the neighboring, larger metropolitan district to handle the week's hearings. Deputy Martin Hayes, fresh off his shift and running on coffee and adrenaline, sat in the gallery of courtroom 3B. He was dressed in his Class A uniform, his brass polished, his demeanor confident. He wasn't there for Eleanor Vance. Her arraignment wouldn't happen for weeks. Hayes was there for a much bigger prize. He was the state's star witness in a suppression hearing for a major narcotics trafficking case he had busted 3 months prior. It was a career-making case, a trunk full of contraband discovered during a traffic stop. The defense attorney, a sharp, aggressive public defender, had filed a motion to suppress the evidence, arguing that Hayes's initial search of the vehicle was unconstitutional and lacked probable cause. Hayes wasn't worried. He knew the script by heart. He knew exactly what phrases the judges liked to hear: furtive movements, nervous behavior, odor of contraband, the magical incantations that almost always rubber-stamped a questionable search. The heavy wooden doors beside the bench opened and the bailiff's voice boomed across the room, commanding all to rise for the honorable judge presiding. Hayes stood, his hands clasped behind his back, expecting to see the familiar, tired face of a substitute judge who would eagerly push the docket along. Instead, a woman walked up the steps to the bench. She was dressed in the heavy black folds of a judicial robe. She moved with a commanding, terrifying grace. She took her seat, arranged her files, and looked up at the courtroom. Hayes felt all the air leave his lungs in a single, silent rush. The blood drained from his face, leaving him cold and clammy under the stiff collar of his uniform. It was her. The faded sweatshirt was gone, replaced by the highest authority of the court. But the calm, piercing, unyielding eyes were exactly the same. Judge Eleanor Vance looked out over the gallery, her gaze sweeping past the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, before landing squarely on Deputy Hayes. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer a dramatic smile or a look of vindictive triumph. Her expression was completely impassive, a blank slate of absolute professionalism. She looked back down at her docket, her voice echoing clearly through the microphone as she called the case of the State versus Miller, the narcotics case on which Hayes's career currently hinged. Hayes's walk to the witness stand felt like a march to the gallows. He swore the oath, his voice trembling ever so slightly, and took his seat. The young prosecutor began the direct examination, lobbing easy questions to let Hayes lay out the narrative of the traffic stop. Hayes recited his well-worn script, detailing how the suspect had crossed the yellow line, how he had seemed unusually nervous upon approach, and how Hayes had seen him make a furtive movement toward the center console, prompting a search of the vehicle for officer safety. The prosecutor sat down, looking pleased. Then the public defender stood up, ready to begin the cross-examination. But before the defense attorney could speak, Judge Vance raised a hand. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany bench, interlocking her fingers. The courtroom fell dead silent. A judge interrupting before cross-examination was rare. It signaled an intense, critical interest in the testimony. "Deputy Hayes," Judge Vance began, her tone conversational but carrying the heavy weight of impending scrutiny. "Before counsel proceeds, the court requires some clarification on your establishment of probable cause." "Yes, Your Honor," Hayes choked out, his throat dry. "You testified that the defendant made a furtive movement toward the center console, which you interpreted as a potential threat to your safety, justifying a search under the automobile exception and the principles of Terry," she stated, citing the law with a casual precision that made Hayes sick to his stomach, recognizing the exact cadence of the woman at the gas station. "Could you describe, in precise anatomical detail, what this furtive movement looked like?" Hayes swallowed hard. He reached toward the middle of the car, Your Honor. Quickly, Judge Vance repeated, writing a note on her pad. "And was this movement distinct from someone, say, reaching for their vehicle registration, or perhaps turning off the radio?" "It looks suspicious to me, given my training and experience," Hayes recited, clinging to his favorite defensive shield. "Your training and experience," she echoed. "Let us explore that. In your training, are you taught that the assertion of one's constitutional rights, for example, asking if they are suspected of a crime before providing identification, is in itself a suspicious act?" The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. That is not a fact in this current case." "Overruled," Judge Vance said, instantly, not breaking eye contact with Hayes. "This court is determining the credibility and the legal understanding of the officer who conducted the warrantless search. I will allow the inquiry. You may answer the question, Deputy." Hayes gripped the edges of the witness stand. "No, Your Honor. Exercising rights isn't a crime." "Excellent. We agree on the Constitution," Judge Vance said, her voice dropping a degree in temperature. "Let us return to the search in question. You stated you believed the suspect was reaching for a weapon, yet your incident report notes that you did not unholster your own weapon, nor did you immediately command the suspect to show his hands. You simply asked him to step out of the car, and then you began to search the vehicle. Is it your customary practice to casually invite a suspect to step out of a vehicle if you genuinely believe they have just armed themselves?" Hayes was trapped. If he said yes, he looked incompetent and reckless. If he said no, he admitted that he never actually believed there was a weapon, destroying his justification for the search. I was assessing the situation, Your Honor." "I see," Judge Vance said softly. It appears to this court, Deputy Hayes, that your assessments rely heavily on retroactive justifications. You conduct a search based on an assumption, a bias, or a desire for compliance, and when challenged, you apply the language of the law, furtive movements, officer safety, or perhaps even the phantom odor of contraband, to legitimize an intrusion that violates the Fourth Amendment. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The prosecutor was staring at the table, realizing his case was disintegrating. The defense attorney was trying unsuccessfully to hide a look of awe. Hayes felt naked, stripped of his badge and his authority, reduced to a man being scolded for lying. Judge Vance did not bring up the gas station. She didn't need to. She was systematically dismantling his entire methodology, exposing the lazy, unconstitutional shortcuts he had taken for years, using the exact legal framework he had ignored the night before. She cornered him on the timelines of the stop, the lack of corroborating dashcam footage regarding the suspect's driving, and the undeniable reality that his search was a fishing expedition, entirely devoid of individualized articulable suspicion. After 30 minutes of surgical, relentless questioning, Judge Vance leaned back in her leather chair. The Fourth Amendment is not a suggestion, Deputy Hayes. It is not an obstacle for law enforcement to bypass with rehearsed catchphrases. It is the absolute bedrock of a free society, designed specifically to protect citizens from arbitrary harassment and unlawful searches by agents of the state. When an officer substitutes his own bias and assumptions for probable cause, he does not just violate a citizen's rights. He poisons the well of justice from which we all must drink. She looked down at the prosecutor. The motion to suppress the evidence found in the vehicle is granted. Because this evidence is the sole basis for the charges, does the state wish to dismiss the case? The prosecutor, defeated, nodded. Yes, Your Honor, the state dismisses. Case dismissed, Judge Vance ruled, making a note on the file. She looked back up at Hayes, who was still frozen on the witness stand. You are excused, Deputy. As Hayes stumbled down from the stand, moving toward the heavy oak doors to escape, Judge Vance's voice stopped him one last time. And Deputy Hayes? He turned back, dread pooling in his chest. A transcript of today's testimony regarding your understanding of search and seizure protocols is being forwarded to your precinct captain, alongside a formal complaint from this chamber regarding a separate incident of unlawful detainment and false arrest. We must ensure our officers understand the law they are sworn to uphold. There was no dramatic slamming of a gavel, no screaming, no cinematic arrest of the corrupt cop. There was only the slow, grinding, terrifying reality of the legal system working exactly as it was supposed to, turning its massive weight against a man who thought he was above it. Hayes walked out into the hallway, his career in ruins, his credibility destroyed, knowing that an internal affairs investigation and a massive federal civil rights lawsuit were barreling toward him. He had arrested a black woman in sweatpants because he assumed she was powerless. He had forgotten that power does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a robe, and it possesses a memory as long and unforgiving as the law itself. The courtroom moved on to the next case. Judge Vance adjusted her glasses, opened a new file, and continued the unglamorous, necessary work of holding the line between order and tyranny. The events of the night and the morning left a lingering silence in the air, asking a fundamental question to anyone paying attention. If the system can so easily strip away the rights of a judge simply because she stepped out of her car in the wrong neighborhood, what hope does the average citizen have when the flashing lights appear in their rearview mirror? And who is truly guarding the guardians?